Why don't you discuss some of the documents that caught your eye and are important for people to know about?
Unbelievable. We had three basic sets of records, and I'll describe what they are and then go into detail about one of them. The three sets of records were the Northwood Documents from 1962, from the spring of 62. They were explosive in what they told us about the government. Let's invade Cuba and let's come up with some good excuses for it that we can sell to the world and the American people. And it included things like sinking an American ship in Guantanamo Bay and blaming it on the Cubans. And actually sinking a real ship in the bay, in the naval base, and blaming it on Castro. Another one was simulating an attack on Guantanamo Bay and blaming the simulated attack on Castro. One of the most horrific ones was launching a terror campaign, a real terror campaign in Miami and Washington, D.C., in which some people would actually be maimed or wounded if necessary, and that it would be blamed on Castro agents in America. And one of the other pretexts they came up with was simulating an attack on an American airliner, filled with real passengers, simulating an attack with a so-called MiG jet, a Russian-built jet, with by taking a U.S. jet, an F-86, which is a Korean War stubby fighter plane. They wanted to take an F-86 fighter plane and paint Cuban markings on it, and have it simulate an attack on an airliner. And then the most horrible one, in my view, was they wanted to have an airliner take off full of simulated passengers, people that would really be on intelligence payroll, and then secretly land the airliner and unload the passengers. Nobody would know about that, of course. And then launch another airliner that was a remote-controlled bomb, basically. Launch a remote-controlled airliner with no passengers in it, fly it over Cuba by remote control, and then blow it up over Cuba and claim that with, fake recordings and everything else, fake broadcasts, claim that it was shot down and blown up by the Cuban Air Force. So they had all these pretexts for invading Cuba, and it's not only did the Joint Staff come up with this, but the Joint Chiefs of Staff approved it.
Yeah, and you know what? You've overlooked the one I think is the worst, the most heinous.
Which one?
It's blowing up American astronaut John Glenn.
That wasn't part of Northwoods, but it was one of the other dirty tricks documents. And what that said was, if the flight fails for some natural reason, we will blame it on Castro. That was a pretty disturbing one, too.
Right, and when I think about these, reflect on the reasons in Northwoods that you've elaborated on, it reminds me of like a 9/11 or some of these other, bombings and things that have gone on. It's just like, wow, if they were thinking about that back in 63 or 62, and when Kennedy shut them down, like you mentioned, the Joint Chiefs approved them.
Right, and here's the interesting thing. At the time we were in session, I couldn't find any records then that indicated what happened to these recommendations. But David Talbot, the author of the book Brothers, got a hold of a document released I think he said it was released in 2005. It was one of these that was scheduled for later release by the review board. And so it was finally released, and it was a set of minutes from a meeting at the White House in which General Lemnitzer, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, tried to raise this subject of these pretexts for invading Cuba, and Kennedy, according to the meeting minutes, shot him down and said, "We're not doing that." And so what's remarkable about that is that the document that David Talbot got a hold of and that he wrote about in his book tells us that it was officially rejected. And then what I know is that the very next month after it was rejected by the president, the Joint Chiefs got up on their hind legs and decided to write a scolding, red-hot memo to the Secretary of Defense, to their boss, castigating him, basically saying, we believe it's in the national interest of the United States to invade Cuba immediately with U.S. forces. They said the existence of a communist Cuba is incompatible with the security interest of the United States. And that was sent to McNamara in April of '62. So this was some pretty strong stuff, and I recall the excitement among the board members when, I revealed to them that we had discovered these documents, and we should open them in full, and they agreed. So I mean, that's the good side of the review board. They said yes, and so this was the beginning, I think, of the mainstream historians really beginning to understand how much at odds President Kennedy was with his own national security establishment. It wasn't just the CIA he was at war with after the Bay of Pigs. It was his own Pentagon. So I think that's when the veto was cast on his life, his decision not to invade. And of course, today we should all be very grateful because we learned 29 years after the crisis what we didn't know then. We learned 29 years later that, not only did the Russians have medium-range ballistic missiles in Cuba, strategic weapons with nuclear warheads on them, but they also had 102 battlefield nuclear weapons. We didn't even know that in 1963. 102 battlefield nuclear weapons. 12 of them were Luna missiles with 2-kiloton warheads. That's a small nuclear yield, but it would still destroy a lot of ships at sea or destroy a lot of troops on the beach. They had 12 of those. They had 80 cruise missiles that were the size of a kind of a scaled-down robot MiG airplane with Hiroshima-sized bombs in them. And they were designed to be fired at, for example, like Guantanamo Naval Base. They were going to fire 3 of them at Guantanamo if we invaded. They would have been fired at the invasion beaches themselves. They had 80 of those things. And then they had 6 nuclear bombs that could have been delivered by IL-28 bombers. So and 4 nuclear mines for underwater. So they had a total of 102 tactical nukes. When those things were put in Cuba to protect the Russian missiles, the commanders in Cuba, the Russian commanders, were told, you have permission to use these tactical weapons on your own authority if there's an invasion that begins and you cannot contact Moscow. You have permission to use the weapons. And that was their mindset the whole time, was that if the Americans invade, we're going to fry them to protect our own strategic nuclear missiles. And we didn't know that. And so all these people like Curtis LeMay and even Chairman Maxwell Taylor, the new chairman of the Joint Chiefs, he wanted to invade and bomb. LeMay, all the Joint Chiefs supported bombing and an invasion, and many of Kennedy's key civilian advisors had become resigned to doing it. By the time October 27th rolled around, probably the worst day of the missile crisis, Saturday the 27th, McNamara himself and others had become resigned to the fact that it's going to happen. We're going to have to invade and bomb. And Kennedy found a diplomatic solution. And so, we all avoided disaster by a human hair, because if the American invasion fleet had been fried at sea with nuclear weapons, and if the American Marines and Army divisions had been fried on the beach, and if Guantanamo had been destroyed by these 3 FKR cruise missiles that were going to be launched if we invaded, we would have had World War III, because we would have had to retaliate somewhere against the Soviet Union, and then that would have been it. And we know now that if we had destroyed half the planet with our overwhelming nuclear arsenal, the whole planet would have gone into nuclear winter. Not only would there have been tremendous nuclear fallout, causing mutations and sickness for generations, but the world's, because of all the smoke and ash from all the nuclear fires, nuclear explosions, and the burned cities, the Earth's would have been, all the sunlight would have been blocked from the Earth for at least 4 or 5 years. Temperatures would have fallen, plant life would have died, and the food chain would have been destroyed. So it would have been a global catastrophe. Even if the Russians had not destroyed one U.S. city, even if we had gone completely unscathed, half the planet would have been destroyed, and that would have been it for Western civilization, human civilization on the planet Earth. And so we should all be grateful that Kennedy found a diplomatic solution. When McNamara found out about all the tactical nuclear weapons in Cuba, 29 years later, I saw him in tears. He was in tears on Larry King on CNN. He was that shaken. Kennedy was lectured on the advantages of doing a preemptive first strike on the Soviet Union. We can nuke these guys. We have such a tremendous superiority over them in nuclear weapons. We can wipe them out in a first strike and get rid of our adversary forever. And, he rejected that twice. He rejected it in 61 and again in 63. By the time they learned about his approaches to Castro, his secret approaches to Castro in September and October, the assassination plot was already long ago in motion.
And also that doesn't get a lot of publicity is the unprecedented move to end the space race and go cooperatively, jointly to the moon. That's
correct. And, I'm a space buff, and I love the Apollo space program. I'm a historian of the Apollo program. I have every book that you could ever purchase about it, every piece of film. And I didn't know about that until I saw Oliver Stone's movie. And so I said to myself, oh, I got to check this out. I don't know if that's true or not. And it is true. Kennedy went before the United Nations in September of 1963. And he proposed, instead of having a race, why don't we go to the moon together, the Russians and the Americans? And not only did he make a speech about it in the United Nations, but he issued a National Security Action Memorandum to the head of NASA, James Webb. Now, I'm doing this from memory. As I recall, I believe that NSAM to the head of NASA went out in early November '63, but it ordered Webb to begin planning for joint lunar landings with the Soviets, and it told Webb, you will be the single point of contact. I want you to get it going and report back to me in December. And that NSAM was actually signed by President Kennedy. And so this could not have made anyone in the so-called military-industrial complex happy at all. So that's a real indication of where his mind was in '63, because he knew how symbolic that would have been. Let's say it might not have happened by the end of the decade. It might have taken a little bit longer. It might have taken 5 years longer. But for two astronauts from two countries to land in a spaceship made by the two countries together and get out and put two flags in the soil of the moon into the regolith, a Soviet flag and an American flag, that would have been very powerful symbology. And I think he understood that it could have been the symbol of the end of the Cold War.